My name is David Ken. I'm a principal scientist at AbbVie and also an active member of IQ Consortium. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Carsten Tempe, who is an expert scientist at Hoffmann-La Roche, based in Basel, Switzerland. Prior to joining La Roche, Carsten held positions at Novartis, Eli Lilly, and Schering. Carsten has also completed his PhD thesis in pharmaceutical chemistry at the Philipps University Marburg, Germany, and he has wealth of experience, close to 20 years in solid dosage form development from early to late stage. Carsten is also an inventor and co-inventor of multiple international formulation patents. I'm also happy to note that Carsten is an active member of IQ Consortium and also the EU PFI. With that, please welcome Carsten to share with us the formulating polywater soluble drugs for pediatrics. All to you, Carsten.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks to the organizing team here to support me. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is, let's say, the pediatric drug delivery in the good old days with a teaspoonful of sugar, or there was also opium recipes used more than 100 years ago. But of course, this is not our topic. So next slide, please. Yeah, unfortunately, the formulation of polysoluble drugs started with a tragedy, and that was in 1938. There was an elixir using sulfanylamide, which was already marketed before, but now it was used also in children, and as a co-solvent, D-ethylene glycol had been used, and more than 100 people died very tragically. And this led then to the introduction of the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act in 1938 after that tragedy. And what you can see here is a report of a medical doctor, Dr. Calhoun, who even expressed his, let's say, how sad he was that one of his best friends died with this elixir. Of course, there was a lack of knowledge about the toxicity of D-ethylene glycol. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is also one of the, let's say, challenges for polysoluble drugs, that we have to use often specific excipients, where the ADI or permissible daily exposure values are not always established. So there might be also toxicity of excipients in very young children due to a lack of metabolic capacity, and often it can happen that children will suffer, or in the worst case, even deaths of neonates have been reported with propylene glycol, or with benzyl alcohol. The gasping syndrome was reported, where there's a lack in these very young children to oxidize the benzyl alcohol to the benzoic acid. And this led to encephalopathy and renal failure, and sometimes also even to death. Next slide, please. Yeah, of course, pediatric formulations, and I'm sure most of you are fully aware of this. What, in generally spoken, we need to consider: taste, palatability. We have to create new formulations, maybe mini tablets. We have to take care about the dosing accuracy. Often food compatibility is an issue for children, so if soft food has to be used, and of course, as a pharmaceutical company, we have to take care about the development times if there's a business case. Yeah, you can already go to the next slide. So these are very general requirements, and more specifically, what are now the, let's say, categories of polysoluble compounds. So most of you have seen this probably, so we can differentiate brick dust molecules and so-called grease balls. So the brick dust molecules typically have very high melting points. They are rather hydrophobic than lipophilic. Phenytoin is a good example, and it's sodium salt. Some cyclodextrin formulations, and the grease balls, they have much lower melting points, often less than 200 degrees Celsius, and they have a higher log P. And a very good example is halophantrin, which has a melting point of 81 to 84 degrees and a log P of 8.5. Next slide, please. So generally, what if you have to deal with a polysoluble compound, either a grease ball or a brick dust molecule? So what are the challenges now to develop a pediatric formulation? So first of all, there's a limited portfolio of established excipients, let's say polymers, surfactants. It might be sometimes difficult to establish a maximum tolerated dose or the safety, especially in very young pediatric populations. It can happen that the manufacturing technology is not available in-house. With nano milling, for instance, also probably many companies don't have that, so you have to look maybe for a partner. There might be device needs, so you need eventually a syringe, or the drug has to be dosed via enteral feeding tubes. In cancer, often you have to deal with high drug loads that might be difficult to formulate, and then you have to translate this everything in a pediatric formulation. And last but not least, and I will talk a little bit later about this, the physical and chemical stability of these formulations. So the next slide, please. Yeah, this is a high-level overview about which technologies are, which are the tools we can apply to formulate pediatric formulations for water-soluble compounds. So first of all, very obvious, the particle size reduction by milling or nanomilling. Then we have a more and more promising field of amorphous solid dispersions. There are also a couple of marketed products. More on the right side, you see, let's say, things which are also rather basic, that better soluble salt is screened at the early stages, or a co-crystal can be found. Of course, companies would select a polymorph which has a better solubility. And if you go more to the left side, you see the lipid-based systems. I will talk also more about this in detail, and the cyclodextrin formulations. Next slide, please. So yeah, so you know now which are the technologies, which tools do we have, what are the challenges in general to develop a pediatric formulation, and overall this development of a pediatric formulation is well aligned with the current discussion about patient centricity. So for those who are located in the US, so the FDA is planning here to issue a patient-focused drug development guidance series and to incorporate more the patient voice in medical product development and regulatory decision making. And if we now look specifically here for the children, you see these circles, and you see in the inner circle excipient safety, the complexity of dose administration by the caregivers. This is a very important point, the home administration. Of course, taste, yes, can really become a showstopper for in children if they don't like the medication. Let's say a cancer drug with a terrible taste, you can completely spoil the whole treatment, more or less. No? And palatability, size of dosage forms. And of course, you have to consider what age group is targeted. Are these newborns or toddlers or school children? And last but not least, the disease specifics. Is this something which should be given once a day, twice a day, or do we need a sustained release formulation? So it's really a complex decision making with the additional complexity regarding the physical chemical properties of the molecule. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a few slides which are, besides the molecule itself and the general requirements for pediatric medications, look at the pharmacokinetic topics in children. This is a slide I've taken from a former presentation. And here you see the black areas show the relative body size, starting with newborns, going to geriatric people. And the shadows represent the rate of drug metabolism relative to the body size. And what you can see here, for very young children, you see huge shadows. So that means there is the rate of drug metabolism can be much higher than in, let's say, for instance, elderly patients. Next slide, please. Yeah, this again shows more in detail. It's a very busy slide, sorry for that, but you don't need to read everything in detail, but you see here on the x-axis of these graphs, you see the age. And let's take one look. For instance, if you look on the right side, there is a renal function displayed, and across different ages, so starting with newborns and then going to school children at the age of 12 years, and the glomerular filtration rate, and you see how significant the changes are here. If you look down at the bottom of the slide, this is the changes in gastrointestinal functions, so hydrochloric acid production, bile acid secretion, intestinal glutathione conjugation, and if you go to the left side to the top, you see also the changes in metabolic capacity. So assume that in a very short lifetime period, there can be also dramatic changes in the body, in the physiological body functions, and this also needs to be somehow considered with regards to the formulation that you might select for a polysoluble drug, and I will come to that later. Next slide, please. This is one slide. This table shows you also the changes, the gastrointestinal conditions over the age, from neonates to adolescents and adults. You don't need to look at each and every row. Just look, for instance, intestinal lipase. You see neonates 16 units per milliliter and adults 1000 U per milliliter. You see there's a dramatic change in the numbers. Or bile acids 1 to 2 millimolar, and poor enterohepatic recirculation for neonates, and then look in the right side, 3 to 5 millimolar in fasted and 10 to 15 millimolar in fed state. So this can have a significant impact also on the, let's say, property, how a lipid formulation that you might have selected might get digested then in very young children, for instance. Next slide, please. So this is a cartoon that somehow, let's say, displays the decision formulators have to make. So you get a new molecule. Maybe initially you don't know exactly, is this a BCS2 or is this rather a BCS4? So I experienced several times some debates whether it's 2 or 4. Nevertheless, in both categories, you have to deal with the low solubility. And then the next, let's say the level below shows you, on one hand, on the right side, the pediatric requirement, as already mentioned, age groups, the dose strength that are required by the clinicians, the size of the dosage form, which is acceptable, the safety of the excipients, the complexity of the drug administration, what has the caregiver to do, maybe a multiple step preparation of the medication, what kind of soft food can be given, what kind of soft foods are not possible. Do we need a device? Do we need an oral dispenser, a syringe? Do we need an enteral feeding tubes, or let's say anything else? And how is the compatibility of your drugs that you want to develop with these systems? And if you look on the left side, you have to select the most appropriate technology based upon the solubility. This is, of course, very obvious, not because it's polywater soluble. The dose strengths, let's say, develop a several 100 milligrams formulation can be very challenging, and with that the drug load and the safety and the physical chemical stability of your very special enabling system. And then one level below, you see again on the left side the technical aspects, and of course this can be very molecule specific, so there might be a preference for a solid dispersion. Or alternatively, if you, for instance, in your company have a lot of experience with cyclodextrins, you might be in favor to firstly try out cyclodextrins, or if you are developing microemulsions or sets or SMETs formulation, you might look at lipid formulations, or eventually some sophisticated size reductions. Salt selections, I would say, is generally pretty basic at the very beginning of at this phases of candidate selection. And of course, then you have to test your sophisticated formulation in a pediatric clinical study. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is very busy. Don't be afraid of this very busy slide. I just want to pick very few examples. So you see here several columns. On the left is the oral drug delivery technology. On the right, the parenteral drug delivery technology. So look at the salt form selection. Methylates, nitrates can be critical, yeah. So it has been described that ethyl methan sulfonate was forming in a product. Nitrite salts might be critical in terms of formation of nitrates. Co-solvents, I already mentioned this, the neurotoxicity, CNS effects. Remember, this benzyl alcohol can cause this gasping syndrome, or even propylene glycol, glycerol, all these very common co-solvents for pharmacists. They can be very critical if you go to very young children, neonates, or premature babies. Yeah. Moving to the lipids and lipid sets, mets, oils formulation. Remember, the bile salt levels are very low in premature babies, neonates, and young infants. So that can also lead to slower digestion of the lipids and reduced solubilization. And on the other hand, for parenterals, it was reported with cremophore can cause anaphylactic reactions. So I would assume that even for parenteral, it's very challenging. Yeah, if you have a very polysoluble drug here to figure out the right excipients that do not cause any safety issues. Cyclodextrins, this is also a long time well known that there's can be problems with renal elimination and renal toxicity. So in the oral field, there's a reduction below 6 to 12 months. And also the kidneys and the nephrotoxicity needs to be considered. There are no data on children less than 2 years. If you move to the parenteral field, there are these substituted cyclodextrins, and there seems to be quite some promising safety rather than versus the non-substituted Cydex formulation. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just maybe, let's say, a repetition of what you have seen many times. This is just to show, okay, we develop a lipid formulation. You have to differentiate between pure oils, which belong to class 1. They require digestion by the bile salts and so forth. And on the other side, if you go to the type 4 ones, they are lipid free. So but they contained soluble surfactants and co-solvents. And remember the discussion we had already about the safety then for specific surfactants or co-solvents. Yeah. So in type 2 and 3A and 3B are standing between. Yeah. So even formulation development of a lipid formulation has to be carefully considered, also with regards to the age group. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is now an interesting example. I think you can generally also learn a lot from the marketed products, and I assume that the companies also developed a lot of thoughts how to formulate in a pediatric dosage form. So looking here at Agenerase, so the Amprenavir, an HIV antiviral drug. And you see it was for the adults, it's a big soft gelatin capsule. It contains vitamin E TBGs as a surfactant, and in addition polyethylene glycol 400 and propylene glycol. Okay, and then for the children, of course, you cannot deliver such a huge soft gel. So the company developed then an oral solution. And if you check here the excipient list, it's quite interesting because the key drug delivery principle, I would say, has been preserved. It's still vitamin E TBGs, PEG 400, propylene glycol, interestingly. and some flavors, bubble gum flavor, citric acid, menthol, and so forth, and natural peppermint flavor. So that means the company has preserved the drug delivery principle, and considering the severity of that disease, so HIV infections, probably it can be justified then in such cases to also allow excipients which you probably would not choose for a non-life threatening disease. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a bit a summarizing slide, also pretty busy, shows you the elements of lipid digestion in the gut here. So to summarize, the challenges are the lower bile salt levels for younger children, the reduced solubilization capacity in intestinal media, and there might be also different motility patterns compared to adults, different food effects. And of course, we have talked about the metabolic patterns in young children. So the efflux transporters and metabolic enzymes might be lower. And of course, the size of the dosage form might be critical. Think about these big soft gelatin capsules. This is not possible for young children. Next slide, please. Yeah, moving to the cyclodextrin formulation. To be honest, I'm not an expert in cyclodextrin formulation, so this is just a rather textbook slide which shows you the differences between these multiple Cydexes that are commercially available. So they are different by the number of pyranose units, and there are some substituted Cydex formulations which seem to be a bit better tolerable, especially for parental formulations. This is here the hydroxypropyl beta cyclodextrin and the sulfobutyl eta beta cyclodextrin. So they seem to be quite acceptable. Next slide, please. Yeah, here now a concrete product. So ramipril, antihypertensive drugs that I was also astonished that in children this can also happen. And so far, with there's no commercial formulation as a counterpart to this altase, but there are some, let's say, formulations which might be prepared in a hospital pharmacy or so, or in a pharmacy generally, and they can be formulated also with the substituted hydroxypropyl beta cyclodextrin to improve the solubility. And I have found that there is also from Rosemont Pharmaceuticals, I'm not making any advertisement, but they have developed also here a formulation which contains propylene glycol, so a co-solvent, and some preservatives and so forth. And but also here are some safety warnings. So the side effects were more significant in children aged between 2 and 16 years old. And so just to show that cyclodextrins, yes, can be used, but there might be a preference for the substituted ones. The next slide shows you then, please, Brent, move to the next slide. Here, this shows you another example. It's an IV injection. It's called Vifent, voriconazole. It's an antifungal drug. And this shows you here also pediatric dosage form where a sulfobutyl substituted beta cyclodextrin is used then to complexate this poorly soluble drug in a solution then. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is again a little summary. I mean, we have already mentioned this. For the oral delivery, there are not data for children under 2 years old. And in the parenteral arena, we have these substituted hydroxypropyl beta and sulfobutyl eta cyclodextrins are considered safe at relatively high doses and used most widely in parenteral products. Again, I have to apologize. I'm not really here as a top expert in cyclodextrin formulation. I know that Marcus Brewster, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago from Johnson & Johnson, he was really more or less the pope in this field. So, but I know that, for instance, J&J colleagues, they are also have a lot of know-how about this, and for sure there are more companies in this world who have experience to develop cyclodextrin formulation. But of course, you have to have that a little bit a track record of expertise to use cyclodextrins for sure. Next slide, please. Yeah, again, very busy, but don't be confused. This shows you solid dispersions and nano formulations. The solid dispersions only in the oral field, of course. There are no parenteral formulations feasible with solid dispersions. And interestingly, and it's really more and more surprising how many solid dispersions are now in industry, pharmaceutical industry, developed also for children now, with a couple of approvals in the last couple of days years, sorry. And what's the issue here? There might be a lack of some long-term pediatric data for the excipients, for polymers, plasticizers, surfactants, and eventually some chronic effects in the GI tract after oral administration cannot be excluded. More tricky is the nano formulation field. By the way, anyway, we do not have so many nano formulations on the market in the oral field. There was a bit of a hype a couple of years ago with this nano milling, and this is a handful of products. A very nice example is this Ement Apritan from Merck. It's used as a prevention for the prevention of nausea and vomiting in cancer types and also in children. Firstly, it was limited to pediatric patients 12 years and older, but I've seen in the meantime there are also granules for oral suspension. I will show you in a minute. There's another product, Rapamune, sirolimus, an immunosuppressive agent. And here the limitation is patients aged more than 13 years. So I'm not sure whether this, in the meantime, also they have developed something in the pediatric field. Yeah, and then parenteral wise, so we have Megace, megestrol acetate is a marketed nano suspension. Here you have to take care that these formulations have to be sterilized. So and in the case of liposomes, there's sterile filtration possible. Yeah, an old example here is Quinaquion with lecithin glycocholic acid with vitamin K here. There are also nanoparticles. Yeah, so you can find a few examples for nano in the nano field, but I would say overall, compared to the other technologies, rather limited. Brand, please go to the next slide. Yeah, this is just for those who are eventually not so familiar with how to make such formulations. I'm just picked here the solid dispersion explicitly because they are quite more and more becoming quite popular for pediatric formulations for polywater soluble drugs. So hot melt extrusion. So typically you mix here then the API with suitable polymers, plasticizers, and these solid dispersants can be extruded, can be further downstream processed, milled, and tableted and coated and so forth. And so here the principle is that the drug is amorphously embedded in a polymer. Alternatively, you can use spray drying. So in that case, the API is dissolved in a non-toxic solvent like ethanol or acetone, and then sprayed together with the polymer, or the polymer is also has to be dissolved, of course. And then very fine particles result, which will be collected in the cyclone. And this powder, which is then resulting, has to be further downstream processed. You can, let's say, roller compactate such powders. 20, 30 years ago, if you look into the literature about solid dispersion, there was always a very negative opinion about solid spray drying because it was huge amounts of solvents that have to be used. I think all this has improved in the meantime, and there are a few pharmaceutical companies who are using now also this technology to manufacture solid dispersions. Besides these two approaches, there are other approaches to manufacture solid dispersions with milling or some hot melting, some general melting approaches. Yeah, this is then probably also more exotic. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a little bit view back to understand the history. Why? Because in 30, 40 years ago, solid dispersion were really viewed as metastable systems. And I remember when I started in industry, when we were talking to our management, they say, "Oh no, this is too thermodynamically unstable, and please don't touch on that." So there was really very negative thinking about this approach. It was more located in academia. But over the decades, all the analytical technologies improved, and you see here also in the formulations itself, there was a movement in further developing this formulation, where the first started with crystalline carriers like fructose, urea, mannitol. In the 1970s, and the polymers were introduced: polyvinyl pyrrolidone, pyrovinyl acetate, HPMC, HPC, ethyl cellulose, and so forth. And then often these systems were rather heterogeneous, so there were parts of the drug dissolved and non-dissolved small microcrystalline particles to a limited miscibility. Later in the 1990s until now, you can observe that further improvements were made by including some surface active substances like gelosia, compritol, and many others. So to improve the precipitation robustness, so-called precipitation inhibitors were added. So I'm just telling you this because we think that the solid dispersion technology is really a quite attractive approach to develop a solid dispersion, and while it was very uncertain in the beginning, now I think there's a lot of know-how how to develop such formulations available. Please, the next slide. Yeah, this is a nice example. It's from Vertex in Boston. Its product is called Ivafta-Vufor, and the INN name is Calideco. It's a drug against cystic fibrosis, and if you look on the left side, this product Calideco here, film-coated tablets with 150 milligram of the drug, and the company developed a solid dispersion with hydroxypropylmethyl cellulose acetate succinate, which often has been described in literature also to act as an let's say precipitation inhibitor. And look what the company had developed now for children from the age of 6 months to less than 6 years of age. They supply the medicine as oral granules, which are mini tablets. So then labeled as oral granules, and there are 50 milligram and 75 milligram packets available. And also here the drug delivery principle is kept, so it's also a solid dispersion based on HPMCS. This is also something where you would probably like to stay with your principle of delivering the drug. Once you have found this, let's say a lipid system as a microemulsion, a SMETS formulation, or a solid dispersion, probably there is really a reason not to completely go away from that, no? Unless you would not, let's say, just develop a co-solvent based formulation, which has, of course, all the known downsides, the other known downsides in terms of toxicity of solvents for young children. The next slide, please. Yeah, this is a bit the challenges, of course, because this talk is also about the challenges, not only the metabolic safety issues we discussed, but here it's about the preparation. So this is an example taken from a Novartis product where a dispersible tablet has to be disintegrated and administered. And you see, very important here, look at the cartoon with the 3 minutes with a clock, and this means there is a limitation of the induced stability, because as we all know, water is a plasticizer, and these formulations are still metastable, of course, and this can in unfavorable cases to lead to an enhanced recrystallization of the amorphously embedded drug. And that means you have to test how long is my formulation stable in a liquid form, because that might be preferred for very young children. So this is a very important aspect to, with all the, let's say, yeah, I would say positive things about solid dispersion on one hand, but of course there's always limitations then. And if you look at the several images above, so that can mean for some caregivers, for some parents, quite a challenge. So because then they have to maybe wear gloves eventually, then they have to put it in the oral dispenser, they have to withdraw maybe a specific volume of water, tap water, and then they have to let's say wait for a certain while until the tablet has disintegrated, and then but not exceeded. Not let's say the oral dispenser should stand in the kitchen for 2 hours, and then the mother comes back and delivers the drug. This is then not acceptable. So there are a couple of steps, and the company also should think about these home administration, how to properly plan and validate those steps if you want to administer such more sophisticated enabling formulations. The next slide, please. Yeah, this is just from a publication taken here. You see here different polymers have been tested, and you see here in this case the HPMCAS, the hydroxypropylmethylcellulose acetate succinate, could keep the dissolution of the polysoluble compound very nicely, whereas the other polymers tested, the drug crushed out. Yeah, so this is of course one of the main challenges, the limited physical and use stability, beside all the other challenges I've talked about already. Next slide, please. Yeah, and now moving to the nano formulation technologies. Yeah, the nano, not every company has this in-house. And so in generally, this is really a very high level cartoon, because each of these topics would be enough to talk for maybe a full day. So you can on one hand precipitate the drug, so they might be in an organic solution, and then you, under controlled conditions, you precipitate the drug to nanoparticles. So typically you would maybe combine it with an anti-solvent, and then the drug crushes out. But you have to stabilize those nanoparticles, because they have this oswald ripening issue, so that the particles might agglomerate and become larger, or more, let's say, on the classical way, you just introduce wet or dry milling technology. So this famous Elan patent with the balls, where the drug was milled, and of course here you have to individually develop the formulation, add surfactants as stabilizers to avoid this oswald ripening. So all these introductions of excipients, of course, if you translate this in a pediatric formulation, you have to carefully consider, is this surfactant safe in that age population, if you want to develop such a drug. And of course, once you have a, let's say, a nano suspension, you can spray dry or can layer on granules in a fluid bed granulator, and have then dry granules that you might want to administer then to children. You can compress it into mini tablets or so on, or you make beads, you coat beads with the nano suspension. Of course, technically all these things have in generally been solved. I think the key point here is to develop a stable nano formulation that is not further growing and then, let's say, jeopardizing the benefit of having very small particles. The next slide, please. Yeah, this is a product example, as again mentioned, this famous example EMENT from Merck, Sharp and Dohme, and aprepitant, so against nausea in cases of cancer treatment, and in former times it was limited to children having a minimum age of 12 years and older, and it is a hard gelatin capsule formulation. And I found that the pediatric formulations, this is on the right side, is now a powder in a sachet, and you can prepare. So you see this little white sachet beside the blue package, and you can prepare a suspension out of it and administer then maybe with an oral dispenser, for instance. So, but again, as mentioned, the examples in the nano field are rather limited if you compare, for instance, with solid dispersion or lipid formulations. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a little bit the challenges, of course, as mentioned. So the polymers or surfactants that you need to add as stabilizers. You have to consider the acceptable daily intakes. And then what I found at least was that in many or several cases, the marketed nanoproducts are not approved for children. So here is another maybe a bit very special example from the times when companies couldn't use the polystyrene beads for nano milling. So, and then they used other milling media. Here in that case, zirconium oxide balls were used. And then you have to take care about some wear from the nano milling media in the formulation. Yeah, so this is here an electronic microscopic image. And let's say also the elemental impurities can be then very strange. But this is probably not an issue if you mill with polystyrene beads. But again, you have to have a lot of know-how in this regarding nano milling technology. And if you don't have this in-house, you probably would look for a suitable partner to develop your drug. Next slide, please. Yeah, now I would briefly like to talk about a very important aspect, and this is the choice of medical devices in combination with the delivery of polywater soluble drugs. And often we need, because still the liquid application is somehow preferred, so you can somehow indirectly a little bit circumvent that you make granules for suspension or so, or you make a dispersible tablet or an oral dispersible tablet. And nevertheless, if you have to administer increments of the dose, you need to use a medical device. That can be a syringe in case of oral delivery, called so oral dispenser. And you have to combine with other elements. So let's say your granules are in a bottle, in a glass bottle. So what Roche, for instance, typically has done also for older products, you put in the bottle then a so-called P-bar, a press in the bottle adapter, and you can combine links this to the oral. So you add the water, you shake the suspension or prepare the solution, and then you withdraw a specific volume with that oral dispenser, which you see in the middle of the bottom of the slide. Or even more challenging, administer the drug through a feeding tube, which is displayed as a photo in the bottom on the right. And then you have to choose the right oral dispenser. What, for instance, would not be appropriate if you want to administer a volume of just 0.2 milliliter with a 10 milliliter syringe. So also the volume of the oral dispenser has to be carefully chosen. So there was, by the way, for those who participated at the conference in September, this virtual UPFI conference, there was a nice presentation from the MHRA about, let's say, things that you can do wrong by not selecting the appropriate device, for instance, the appropriate syringe or the appropriate enteral feeding tubes. Enteral feeding tubes, think about solid dispersion, which can swell the polymer. You might also here have to deal with problems like clogging of the enteral feeding tubes. Yeah. And last but not least, the health authorities worldwide asked for sure about the compatibility of the drug product with the device. So you need to have here substantial analytical support so that you can recover the drug fully and that there's no clogging, and the dosing accuracy has to be guaranteed. So please keep in mind, every time you can measure something like even this little cup, which is very, very basic, but then it's a medical device already, and then all the regulatory requirements apply. And even if you have nicely selected this, don't forget about the patient or the caregivers, because the caregivers then are sitting at the end of the, let's say, supply or food chain in parentheses, and they have to deal with these things, and this might look for them quite complicated. Yeah, so this is another level of difficulty, complexity, which is not only specific for polysolubles, but often it's also combined complexity. The next slide, and this is, yeah, this is now a summary. So I hope you was able to, let's say, show you a little bit an overview about the challenges you have to face when you have to develop a polysoluble, water-soluble drug for children. So there are some, I would say, 4 to 5 main technologies: solid dispersions, lipid systems, salt, cyclodextrines, nanoformulations. We at least think or observe that the solid dispersions, besides the lipid-based formulations, seem to be, at least at the moment, the favorite approaches for polywater soluble drugs, which does not mean that the others are not appropriate. Each case is different, each molecule is different, so it's hard to generalize, but it's really amazing the number of solid dispersions that are now marketed. And I've shown you this Calideco example. Also, by the way, the company, they made a very nice video for caregivers. If you have time, you can find it, or I can also send you a link to that. It's well done, really, for the caregivers also. So it's really well thought. The pediatric application of all these approaches, as several times mentioned, might be challenging with regard to excipient safety. So what's the maximum daily intake? Do we eventually need to qualify the excipients newly? Do we eventually need a juvenile animal tox study? Although this should be also handled with care, we should not exaggerate. If we have a new polymer from BASF or any other company, do we where are the safety data for children? We have now this nice active ingredient database from the FDA, which now, thanks to the FDA, also has the maximum dose of the excipient, but still does not add pediatric numbers. Yeah, so this maybe in the next level of update, this will be added then. Yeah. And okay, the caregiver situation, I have spoken. The in-use stability, think about the solid dispersion, but by the way, also this imment aprepitant nanosuspension also has a limited stability, so you have to use it within 3 hours or so. Yeah, and as mentioned, the medical devices play a significant role in this orchestra of delivering the polysoluble drug properly to the pediatric patient. Yeah, with that, I would like to thank for your attention, and also the organizers and David Ten for his nice invitation. And if there are some questions, I'm glad to answer these if I can. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carsten, for the very enlightening presentation. So there are a couple of questions posted here. I'll start off with the first one. From your experience, is there any good findings on the use of mesoporous silica technology to help with enabling technology for polysoluble drugs, and potentially also help with taste masking in pediatric formulation?
Yeah, I mean, I had a little experience a couple of years ago with this mesoporous silica, and we added some lipids. I mean, I think there might be a benefit if you, let's say, somehow can absorb a lipid formulation and make a solid formulation out of it. I have no experience to directly absorb the drug. I think the main issue might be, even if you can nicely absorb the drug in the pores of the silica. Somehow it has to come out, and then you have to take care about the crushing. So you for sure have to add some precipitation inhibition factor in your formulation. But again, might be useful maybe in combination with the lipidic elements, because these lipids are not so uncommon. There are also some voices saying we should develop more lipidic formulation for children. Why not? Yeah, but yeah, I would not exclude it. Yeah, but I think just solely using that without any precipitation inhibitor principle, I don't know. I would be a bit careful at least.
Okay, thank you, Carsten. And then one other question is, you mentioned about the importance of taste, palatability of drugs, especially in pediatric formulation. So have you any experience on methods to mitigate taste, especially for the surfactants? And also the second question to that as well, do you encourage the team to evaluate organoleptic properties of the molecule in the early stage of drug development?
Yeah, maybe I start with the last question immediately. The organoleptic properties of the intrinsic organoleptic properties of the molecule. I would say it could make sense, especially to evaluate this at an early stage. So let's say via in vitro tests like ETANG, they have their limitations as known, or rat licking studies, or some sip and spit studies. For sure, it will help to at least also guesstimate the resources that might be required to, let's say, apply some taste masking principles. Because at the end, it might be a huge difference to try out the flavors and or do some taste masking, taste mask coating. And more and more the authorities also ask about all these details and also the rationales for the concentration. Yes, for sure, it makes sense. The earlier you know, okay, this is extremely bitter and it's a cancer drug and it has to be given to children, wow, then it's really challenging. No? And the first question about the surfactant levels and whether there's any idea to cope with that issue. First of all, I think if the drug delivery principle is, if it's a life-saving indication, you maybe have to work around that now by adding, let's say, flavors or, yeah, probably more sophisticated things like taste masking or some even microencapsulation, which might be extremely costly then. But I could think that this might be even overcome by rather not so sophisticated approach, means adding a flavor or so, no? Or combining maybe with the soft food. No? And then of course you have to test this. No? Very important is to check the taste in a study. No? With adults firstly, and later with put it in the clinical protocol maybe in addition, no? And see how the patients will react. I mean, if you talk about cancer and you cannot, let's say, circumvent the drug delivery principle itself, that might be challenging. But if you find a better delivering principle which doesn't have that issue and you can avoid using huge amounts of surfactants, of course this is welcome. No? And this is again the challenge and the difficulty and the excellence that the formulator has to provide, no? Then to select the right delivery principle. No? Yeah. I don't have a perfect answer, honestly. Surfactants always do not taste nicely. No?
Yeah. So due to interest of time, I will pose one more question to you. From your experience, do you know the main reasons why nano formulations is less preferred in pediatrics from the regulatory point of view?
Yeah, I mean, there are some groups. I know the FDA. There are some nano groups in the US. I think the FDA has one, and in Europe as well. I remember a couple of years ago, one of the, let's say, more or less key opinion leaders here, Professor Breitkreuz in Germany. You might know him. He published a lot, and he gave a speech at the Gut for C seminar. And I remember he reported that there were some nanoparticles, insoluble nanoparticles found in urine in children, so that these nanoparticles, if they are so small that they would pass the membranes and would go through, then that might be a general concern. I would say it's a mixture of several aspects. It's you don't have experience, then you don't have the technology. You think, nano is in, everybody's talking about nano, but then we don't have it. So you have to maybe partner with the drug delivery company. So I would say it's a multiple aspects that lead to the situation that it's not so commonly used. No, but I think we should consider this, yes, and of course the art to stabilize nano formulations. No? You really have to, let's say, with sophisticated tools, the physical stability you have to check now. You have to use surfactants in higher concentrations, polymers. You have to look at the theta potential and all these physical chemical details. No? This might also be something why companies are not so in favor of that. No? But I think it's not impossible. I have worked. Yeah, sorry, we are out of time. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Carsten. I think this presentation concludes our webinar series for the year 2020. We look forward to meeting you virtually next year for our 2021 webinar series. And thank you again very much, Carsten, for your time. And everyone, take care and stay safe. And we'll see you next year. I'll let Catherine to conclude the webinar. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Carsten. What a great presentation. Again, just echo David's ending is please stay safe and hope that everyone has a great end of your 2020. Thank you.
Thank you.